Okay, so let's get started. Welcome to our final session in our three-part webinar series on ChatGPT and education. We're so excited to have you here tonight, where we will be talking about future directions of AI in education. We will also have recordings available for parts 1 and 2 for people who are not able to see those, and those will be posted through AECT shortly. A couple of quick notes. You should, if this is the webinar format, you should on your screen have some buttons on your toolbar. One of them is chat, where you can have some conversation with people. So we invite you right now to say in chat where you're coming from. Love to see where people are. And then you'll also see a Q&A button. So if you have a question for one of the presenters, please use the Q&A button to post your questions there. And then general comments, resources you want to share, things like that can be in the chat button. You will also notice that there is a captions button on your toolbar too. If you don't see it, it might be under the little 3 dots more. So live transcript has been enabled for this session. So you can turn that on if you would like. Before we introduce our speakers, I just want to introduce our 3 divisions who are hosting this series for you. We have Systems Thinking and Change, the Division of Emerging Learning Technologies, and the Learner Engagement Division. And I will turn it over quickly to Mink Young, who is our President of Systems Thinking and Change.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Part 3 webinar on ChatGPT. And I'm Min-Kyung Kim, and President of the System Thinking and Change Division. So as we begin the last session of our 3-part series, I can't believe how quickly we've reached this point. So I mean, it's truly incredible to see such high level of interest and engagement from everyone. So before we proceed, I'd like to take a moment to appreciate the effort of our planning team once again. So, I mean, their commitment and effort made this session possible. So, and also I'd like to express my appreciation to our exceptional presenters who have willingly shared their expertise. So I'm thrilled to engage in another meaningful discussion today about the future directions of using ChatGPT in education. So thank you.
Great. So let me introduce our first speaker for tonight. We have the pleasure of having Dr. Matt Bauer, who is a professor in the School of Education at Macquarie University. He specializes in the innovative use of technology for learning purposes. And he's particularly interested in how contemporary technologies like artificial intelligence, augmented reality, web-based tools, virtual worlds, all of that stuff can be used to support cognitive development and collaborative learning. And Matt has over 100 peer-reviewed publications. He's also recently won a book award from the AECT Design and Development Outstanding Book Award for his book, Design of Technology Enhanced Learning, Integrating Research and Practice. And tonight he's going to share some of his research on AI in education and share his recommendations for how we should transform teaching and assessment for a world with generative AI. So I'm going to stop my screen here and I will ask Dr. Bauer to take it away.
Thanks very much. So I'm really honored actually and really enjoy engaging with AECT on what is, an amazing time, not only for educational technology, but for humanity. I'm sure that in previous presentations, you've spoken about how fast and impactful generative AI, and I think ChatGPT is really the bellwether of that, has been, with just 2 months to have 100 million global monthly users. The disruption to the labor market is anticipated to be right now that 25% of all jobs could be replaced by AI. And it's interesting that education is one of those jobs where I think there will be massive transformations, but Also, I think we are going to need to have teachers as human beings very much involved in the process. What they do might change, but the actual need for humans as part of education will always be there, I believe. But I think the big question on everyone's mind is, how do we change teaching and transform it for this new world of increasingly powerful generative artificial intelligence? So rather than, because there's a whole lot of rhetoric out there about what we should do, and people have a whole lot of opinions, but I was interested as a researcher to understand better what coalface teachers are thinking. So maybe not always collecting the best ideas, but at least understanding the pulse of how teachers believe they should change their teaching and assessment for a world with generative artificial intelligence. So just two very straightforward research questions. Do teachers believe that they need to change what they teach as a result of generative AI? And if so, how? And do teachers believe that they need to change how they assess as a result of generative AI? And if so, in what way? So the results I'm going to share with you today were basically collected via a survey. We asked them all sorts of background information, their subjects that they were teaching, the level that they taught, and how well they thought ChatGPT was able to answer questions for that level. We used some general linear modeling to examine which demographic and contextual factors influence their perceptions about the impact of AI in teaching and assessment, some thematic analysis to see the sorts of things that teachers thought that should change. And we provided a video that I won't share now due to the constrained time that we have, but it just gave them some front end for those people who hadn't seen AI. This was conducted back in sort of February and either end of January and March, so that it was still a time where people may not have even come across generative AI. So the participants, after we had sort of over 1,000 responses, but as anyone who conducts survey research these days, there were quite a few incomplete or erroneous responses. There were, probably a reasonably typical spread, gender-wise, age-wise, teaching experience, mainly university, but also some secondary teachers and even a few primary teachers. And we also analysed their disciplinary background according to the Web of Science subject area classifications. So you can see a healthy spread from various disciplines in there. So what I'd like to do to keep it a little bit more interactive is prepared a few poll questions. How would you rate your awareness of generative AI? And I understand that I'm talking to a particular group who are interested in technology and education, but I think the poll is going to be shared for you now. So just, okay, we can actually, we've got 3 poll questions altogether. So what I might do, and that's actually good because it might actually speed things up. Could you answer those 3 poll questions that should be appearing on your screen now? And just give you a couple more seconds, and I believe that you can see how many people have answered that, so I'll let you decide when a good time to close the poll is and share the results. Okay, so everyone had a chance to answer that. Maybe Min-kyung, is it time to close and have a look at those results? Okay, so this is really interesting. People are sort of not too dissimilar in that first question to the 318 people who we used as the analysis. So there were a few people who had no experience. Some people had known of it, but not used. Most people are in that briefly tried, and there are some people who have extensive experience. For that next question, we asked people and about what they thought, what the impact was on how they, what they should teach. So do you think it's going to have no impact on what you teach, minor impact, major impact, or a profound impact? And we can see that this group has a bit more of a sense that it would have a major or profound impact on what should be taught. And I think that what we'd probably see is if we reran the survey generally again with teachers, that this may shift over time. And that third question about what, actually, I'll just stick with this a little bit more because I want to drill into some of the interesting nuances of what should be taught and what people were thinking. So what we had was people who were more aware of generative AI, such as ChatGPT, thought it was going to have a higher impact on what should be taught. So I think the lesson there is probably going to be an ignorance effect for a little while, where we have people who don't know about it, and so they don't think that there's going to be much of an impact on what should be taught. There was also a greater perceived impact by university teachers, and that was higher than secondary teachers, and in turn, which was higher than primary teachers, which also I think makes sense. This next one, I don't want to hazard a guess as why females felt that it was going to have a bigger impact on what should be taught than males. All I can sort of come up with so far is that maybe they're just a little bit more diligent and flexible, but I don't want to get into any sort of gender debates on that. Maybe that's an area for future research. And also a significant interaction between the region and the level of teaching experience. So we saw some sort of interesting effects where, for instance, university teachers in Europe with more experience thought that it was going to have a bigger impact than, for instance, or thought it was going to have a big impact, but it was the less experienced teachers in America that thought it was going to have a bigger impact. I don't think there's too much to take from that, other than there can be regional differences to these things. Sometimes just culture or the media may influence people's perceptions differently. So the impact on how we should assess. So we can see it's sort of a similar distribution. And if we look at the results from the poll, and thanks for putting those back up, there is similarly that stronger sort of perception of the impact on how people should assess. We had people, once again, with higher awareness, thought it was going to have a bigger impact on how they should assess. Again, we had that level effect that university and secondary teachers think it's going to have a bigger impact. We had a disciplinary effect here, where teachers from the biomedical sciences felt it was going to have a larger impact on how they assessed, maybe because they have more traditional and text-oriented approaches to assessment. Again, we had females thought it was going to have a bigger influence than males. And again, this interaction between region and teaching experience. So this is also another, I think, interesting sort of finding that people, we asked people, how well is ChatGPT doing on questions that you're asking it for different year levels. So for instance, for year 4 primary or elementary school students, that ChatGPT was doing really well. If we get up to sort of more university, which sort of kicked in at around 13, 14, 15, etc., you can see that there's this slightly decreasing average mark, but it's also one that it is, I think just looking at that, it's all pretty high averages. There's spreads, quite a spread, but all quite high averages. I think it's also really important to think about how teachers say they should change their teaching. So you can see here that they believe that they're going to really need to, in the future, teach students about how to use AI, understanding how the tool itself works, understanding and teaching about critical thinking. There were some teachers who thought that they didn't need to change. Ethical and responsible use of AI, using AI responses as a model. So looking at sort of, for instance, design patterns. Let's put the assignment question into AI and use that as a starting point for our thinking and work in this area. They thought they might have to change the curriculum so to create tasks that can't be completed by AI. We might talk about that in a little bit. And teaching how to teach using AI. And I think that's particularly relevant for us as educators. These were pre-service teachers, I'm suspecting. Pre-service teacher educators who were talking about that. Some thought that they need to teach to discourage the use of AI. There was also a lot of teachers who talked about the need to changing their pedagogical approach towards more active learning, towards more process-based learning. And we'll see that more in the assessment. There's also a need to use AI to support their teaching practice, to design rubrics or set or create really interesting lesson plans. In terms of assessment, teachers were talking about changing assessment task types. So it was more spoken, changing to exams that can be invigilated, video production, visual essay, portfolio. So changing the sort of the use of media. That they needed to change the nature of their assessment tasks to focus more on higher order thinking, assessment, authentic assessment, more personalized, more focused on process, and more sort of referencing and citing and making sure they acknowledged the source of any AI that they were using. There were some people who spoke about the need for greater invigilation and face-to-face assessment. And some were talking about, using AI to help with assessment tasks, that they're going to need to embed that within the assessment specification and process. So that's just sort of a very high-level overview. We have a paper that's under review for education and information technologies, that will have more details. Just some final sort of comments about the current state of where AI is at. We all know that there are detection tools emerging that can take text that students might submit and then give a probability or a likelihood of whether or not it's an AI generated text. And we shouldn't just think in terms of ChatGPT, because of course there are a whole lot of other text-based tools. And we shouldn't just think in terms of text, because we have DALL-E and Midjourney, and I was playing around with Adobe's Firefly, and increasingly we're going to have students using these tools to create images and music and AI video creation. There's some really great work going on in terms of tools that support students, like tutors. And I particularly encourage you, if you haven't already seen it, to have a look at Sal Khan's work in that area, in the Khan Academy and their their Camigo AI tool. Tons of new tools coming through in terms of tool directories. So this is just, we're watching, I feel like, the beginning of a supernova in a way. But in all of this, I think we really need to have ethical frameworks for dealing with and using AI in education. Can I recommend the framework by a colleague of mine, Erica Southgate, and her collaborators, who I think has done a very good job of pulling together all of the literature, scholarship, and principles in this area. And you may like to use that in your work. So my final reflections would be here. We all know it's a wholesale leap in the sort of assistance that technology can provide through generative AI. The responses now might not be perfect, but it's undoubtedly going to keep rapidly improving, where George Siemens is saying that, and I tend to agree, that we need to get used to human beings will not be sort of the most superior form of intelligence into the future. Though that's not to say that there aren't important things that we might be doing by virtue of being the ultimate arbiter, hopefully, of what happens. So decision making in our world. Obviously, the risk is that students won't learn, but if we just ban it, then that's really not going to prepare them for a world with increasingly prevalent AI. So I would encourage against using AI to spend all your time checking whether people have been using it, and instead set some of those more authentic and personalized tasks and look at more process-based learning, as was raised in the responses from teachers. Students will need to learn basic knowledge and skills. It's just because we have spell checkers and calculators doesn't mean that we don't need to learn those things anymore. We don't want to be dependent on those things. However, what we really need to, for success, critically emphasize is those more humanics sort of skills like critical thinking, creativity, ethics, empathy, and also volition, I think, is often one that we don't hear much about, but is very important. It's, I think we're sort of challenged by the idea, if you had superpowers and an army of labor resources to help you, what would you do to make this world a better place? And do you have the motivation and will to do it? And I think that's sort of the opportunity that's coming, and that we need to think about how to teach all of these sorts of higher order thinking skills and values and motivations into the future. So I might stop there because I realize probably at my 20 minutes, but thank you very much. And I look forward to fielding questions at the end.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bauer. And if you do have questions for him, please do use the Q&A to add them, and we will save those for the end. And so now I would like to introduce Dr. Theodore Frick, who is a professor emeritus in the School of Education at Indiana University, Bloomington, where he taught and conducted research for close to 30 years. His recent research is focused on online learning, learning analytics, plagiarism, educology, and artificial intelligence. And tonight he is going to share his ideas about the future of education based on his vast experiences, guiding us to think about what educators should do with AI systems. So, Dr. Frick, all yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
We sure can.
Great. Just a little bit of background. I started working on artificial intelligence, digging into it back in the 1980s, and especially expert systems and neural networks at that time, and did some work on computer adaptive testing. And then it's been just recently, with the emergence of chatbots like ChatGPT and Bard and so forth, that I've gone back and taken another look at it. And so I'll share some of my observations or insights. I'd like to begin by having you consider these two quotations, which one of which is very recent, one of which was a long time ago. The first one is from Alan Kay, and I remember vividly back in the 1980s when he made a presentation at the Indianapolis Children's Museum, and a quote that just stuck in my mind was, "The best way to predict the future is to make it." It just really stuck with me at the time. Alan Kay, by the way, is one of the people who built the modern conception of a GUI, a graphical user interface, when he worked at Xerox PARC back in the 1970s, and that's now become the foundation for the Apple Macintosh interface as well as Microsoft Windows. So he was in there quite early and quite creative in that regard. I lost my. The next quote is from someone who just published this less than a month ago, Jaron Lanier, and he says, "Think of AI as a tool, not a creature." And it's actually an excellent article that he wrote for the New Yorker. He says there is no AI, and makes a pretty good argument for that. I won't go there right now, but I think it's pretty good advice. These two guys, spread apart many years, both worked at Atari at one point in time, earlier in their careers, and then spun off in different directions. Alan Kay worked at Xerox PARC, and then he went on to be a fellow at Apple, whereas Lanier left Atari and started his own company on VR, making VR headsets and hand things that go along with them. I just want to start with those two quotes as a background for this. Now, I think it's really important to think of these things as tools, computers that execute programs as tools rather than sentient beings. I think this is really, really important. And that includes chatbots and other AI systems. And I think the other thing that I've seen historically is that the tools themselves aren't per se good or bad. I mean, some are better than others, but it's how we use them, whether we use them for good or bad purposes. That's what is really important. And I think that's one of my main messages here with newer AI applications such as ChatGPT. And I'll give an analogy. A well-honed and balanced chef knife is very useful for preparing food if you use it carefully and correctly. I use one practically every day. But if you're not careful, you can cut your finger, and that's happened to me a few times. And so you got to be careful when you use it. And of course, you got to use it for things it's good for, and it's not good for pounding nails, and it's not good for sauteing vegetables, but it is good for chopping vegetables. So you need to use it for the right purpose. And worst of all is that the tool can be used for something really bad. Using a knife can murder someone. This is true, I think, of computer applications as well, although I don't know whether they can commit murder or not, but people, the way they use them could cause seriously negative outcomes. So we need to use these chatbots and other AI applications that are coming out now carefully. And that's probably the most important message I have tonight is be careful because they're not very trustworthy right now. I've been working with computers for over 50 years in education. I've done a lot of software development in a number of different languages, going back to the 1970s to the present, including I've written some pretty sophisticated software for computer adaptive testing, which is using expert systems approach back in the 80s and early 90s. I've taught students going back to the 1980s through still now but I'm retired, to use computers. And early on, there were a lot of K-12 teachers in my classes. I taught a lot of higher education faculty, including faculty at my own university and other universities, as well as our own PhD and master's students in instructional systems technology. And I've noticed what I would call some major inflection points along the way. And I'm only going to talk about one of those tonight because there's not a lot of time. But these are the main points here. Starting with mainframe and mini computers. Microcomputers came out in the 1980s, late 70s and early 80s. The web happened around 1992, 93 and on. That really changed things, changed my life a lot. Then the smaller devices that we can put in our pockets are where those have come about. One of the things that's been a quiet revolution, but incredibly important, is cloud computing, which is really massive parallel processing of big data. That has really changed things, including making some of these AI applications that we're now seeing possible. And then now the artificial intelligence and robotics. And what strikes me is I'm seeing some common patterns between, for example, how people were reacting back in the 1980s when microcomputers first came out, what we now call desktops and laptop computers. They were just totally new, especially to people in education. They had no idea what they were. They didn't know how they worked. They didn't know how they could be used. They knew they were important, and they needed to learn something, but it was a big question mark in their minds. And I see a similar pattern right now with AI going on. I see a lot of people wondering about, what is this? And as I said, this reminds me of when the personal computers first came out. A lot of wonderment, and people are asking, what are these things? How do they work? And I think they're not easy to understand, and what I'm going to try to do is to give you a bit more of an introduction to what they are and to what their limitations are. So we're going to move on to machine learning, for especially neural networks for chatbots. And I know David Wiley talked some about this in the first webinar, but I'm going to do a bit of a review and perhaps talk about some different things. One thing that's quite significant is that the kind of machine learning that is done for chatbots results in something called neural networks. And those are the kind of data or sets of relationships that these machines operate on. Now, neural networks is actually an old idea. It's been around for a long time. In fact, when I was doing my work in the 80s, neural networks were being mentioned as possibilities, and some early work was being done on that as well. And what I want to share with you here is a little cartoon that pretty much captures what they're doing. And this was shared with me by a former student, and I also found it in a book I read. And there's these two characters here. And the first one is asking, "This is your machine learning system?" And the second guy says, "Yep. You pour data in one side make a pile of linear algebra, and the answers come out on the other side." And the first person says, "Well, what if the answers are wrong?" And the response is, "Well, just stir it some more and see when they start looking right." And it sounds like it's kind of trite or goofy, but actually, this is a very sophisticated response. Actually, there's a great deal of insight that's going on here. And I'll just point out that it's based on linear algebra, something that we started learning about probably when we were in high school, most of us, and some in college. And that's really the foundation of these systems, linear algebra. And what happens when these chatbots are trained is that these neural nets are formed that the chatbots use is they go through a training phase. And one of the things that happens is that basically all the words in the language being used, for example, English, they're tokenized. Each one is associated with a token, just like a variable was given a name like ABC or XYZ, okay? And then when big data or large amounts of text are scraped from the web or other resources, those words are tokenized. They're turned into their tokens, okay? And then the magic starts happening, and actually it's not magic, it's some well-known mathematical techniques for estimation or getting statistical association. And so basically what happens as all of this information is accumulated and these weights are estimated, they improve the weights to the point where they cannot make it more predictive than it is. In other words, they're trying to reduce the error of prediction, much like we've done with multivariate analysis, such as multiple regression analysis or factor analysis or other statistical techniques. And they're even using some of the same underlying statistics for doing that. So there's mathematical algorithms at work, and basically what they're trying to do is come up with the best set of edge weights in the network that's formed. And I think of these as beta coefficients, like in multiple regression analysis or path analysis, if you know what that is in statistics. Now, here's an example of a digraph. And you've seen this before, just a little bit of terminology. These are the nodes or vertices, as they're called. And the lines with arrows are the edges, okay? And notice in this case, the digraph, the edges have weights like 15, 10, 90, and so forth. And they're usually directed. So this could be node X, this could be node Y, and this is the weight. So this is a relatively simple digraph, and it comes from work of a colleague of mine on a project we did some years ago on graph theory. But it's the same kind of basis that is behind neural networks and a lot of other applications. Now, so instead of having a dozen or so vertices and 50 or so edges, imagine that you've got millions of vertices and billions or trillions of edges, okay? And that's what's happening now in these very large neural nets that they're being formed. But they're just using these tokens and they're estimating weights, relationships among the tokens, and those weights are estimated based on how they follow each other in terms of sequencing in the texts that are scanned in and their nearness or proximity to each other. That's those things affect the weights that turn out in the network. Now I'm going to shift to a systems view, but you'll see how they're pretty much the same, just thinking about it a little bit differently. I want to point out here from this diagram that we've got a system, in this case an AI system, which is the white rectangle with rounded corners here. And very importantly is the AI nega system. In other words, everything that's not in the AI system, the nega system, the not system. Okay, and notice we have properties of tuput, maybe new to you, input, that should sound familiar, frumput, maybe not, output should sound familiar. And then there are temporal processes such feed in and feed out. And then in the nega system, there can be other systems. And one of the key notions is effect relations. And basically just think of those digraphs, or actually stacks of digraphs with weights, how the nodes or vertices are connected to each other, the strength of the association. Now notice the question mark here. One of the problems right now is we do not know, even the experts don't know what's really going on inside these complex systems. They can see what the tuput is, they can see what goes in, and they can see what comes out, but what happens inside is a big question. And so this is that pile of linear algebra, okay? That's what's in there. And as I said, we really don't know what's going on inside in these big complex systems. And just, it's, many people call this the black box issue. We don't know what's in there, but it's really just layers of digraphs with a very, very large number of vertices and edge weights that indicate the strengths of the relationships among the vertices. Now I want to talk briefly about limitations, and this is the big part of this. I want to point out to you that there's a very, very large part of the AI megasystem that is not two-put. In other words, what these AI systems are given, their two-put, is basically signs that have been created by humans, words, digitized words, images that humans have created, okay? That's all well and fine. That's what is their two-put. But what they do not have as two-put is the rest of the big world and culture that we humans directly experience, okay, that big world around us, and with which we associate those signs, those words and pictures and other things that we use. One example I give in an article I drafted is going to a farmer's market, such as one in Bloomington, and going to a vendor that's selling carrots, and you actually smell the carrots. You can touch them, you can taste them, you can later eat them. And so you can talk to other people in the market, and those are experiences that I've had and other people have had, but none of that experience is picked up by the AI system, none of it, okay? They just get the words. We people, us humans, we know what the signs mean because they represent what we've experienced, okay? In fact, we created these words and signs. That's our language. And so as we've been growing up, and we've learned how to associate those experiences with words. And so that's how we derive meaning. And what I want to say here is, I'm going to quote Gregory Bateson, who wrote an excellent book called Mind and Nature. The map is not the territory, and the name is not the thing named, okay? The map is not the territory. The name is not the thing named, okay? That's really, really important. So these chatbots, they may be getting images of maps and they may be getting words or names of things, but they're not getting any experience of the objects being represented in the real world. That's lacking. And this is actually a really telling point. AI systems, at least today's AI systems, lack what's called common sense and understanding. And I have two great resources that I would highly recommend you read about this. One is a book by Gary Marcus and Ernest Davis on rebooting AI. And basically, they're saying you can't build reliable cognitive models unless you know how the world works, people and how they interact, okay? And they're not getting that right now. And so they do and say some pretty stupid and foolish things because they don't have common sense. Another author who's not so well known now, but was many years ago, is Douglas Hofstadter. He wrote Gödel, Escher, and Bach about 40 years ago. And he wrote a recent article in, I think it was The Atlantic, on a machine translation or AI translation. And he also makes the point that even though it seems to be pretty good, it's still the algorithms don't actually understand the language. They're using other kinds of processes. They do a pretty good job, but they really don't have the understanding. So, and then there's Lanier again. and what he has to say about this. And I like his quote. There's just a big giant ocean of jello, a vast mathematical mixing, describing this pile right here. So I'm going to wind up here by saying we need to be very careful with those chatbots, much like we ought to be very careful with that chef's knife that's really sharp. And the main reason I found, and I found this problem not only with ChatGPT, but with Google's Bard and with Microsoft's Bing Chat, for example, they will hallucinate. They will mix in false claims among correct facts and concepts. And you, unless you know yourself already what the correct facts are, you can't separate these, okay? You can't tell them apart. And so people can get misled by this if they don't know which ones are hallucinations. That's not a minor problem. That's actually a major problem if we want to trust these and what they have to say. So I think we just have to be cautious in that regard. I think there's all kinds of potential and possibilities, but we got to be careful. How do we separate the wheat from the chaff? And my response basically is teachers and students, they must think critically. And if they don't think critically and check facts independently, we can get fooled by these AI systems. We can end up looking like dupes. And I've actually written a manuscript on this that hopefully will get reviewed for Tech Trends coming up and potentially published in the future. There's a title. If you're really interested in this, I can give you a link to the manuscript. In the meantime, I want to leave you with those two quotes from Lanier and Kay. Think of AI as a tool, not a creature. And the best way to predict the future is to make it. So with that, I will wind things up. There are some references at the end, and I can make this PowerPoint available through the planners. They'll make it available to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Frick. I feel like I really understand how this works now.
Good.
Which now you can be a little bit more wary about how it works, and you can be a little bit more careful about teaching students about how it works too. So before we get to questions, which you can post in the Q&A button, I'd like to ask our president of AACT, David Wiley, to come back and share some of his thoughts on what he heard tonight and the future of AI in education.
Thanks, Anne. It's good to be back. I was joking before we started that maybe I got invited back for a second try because I'd done such a poor job in the first webinar. But really appreciated the comments tonight. It's interesting to hear the kind of historical perspective going back decades and coming forward. Interesting to hear the kind of attitudinal research, Matt, that you're doing with the survey responses from people and kind of where they're coming from and what they're thinking. So I really enjoyed this again tonight. These have just been great webinars, all of them have. I'm going to try not to lower the average quality here with just a small contribution of my own, with some closing thoughts, at least for this week. It feels like every day is like 100 years if you're actually trying to keep pace with what's happening in the space right now. And I thought, as just to make that point, I might share a couple of things that have happened fairly recently. You'll recognize the first two if you saw the talk 2 weeks ago, but they were very new then. But the rest of this is stuff that's newer. The first thing that's happened is that now everyone who subscribes to ChatGPT has access to plugins. And in my mind, the most powerful of all the plugins is the Wolfram Alpha plugin. ChatGPT as a language model is not very good at math, but Wolfram Alpha is to all the STEM subjects as ChatGPT is to anything having to do with language. So if you've never played with Wolfram Alpha, It's been around for over a decade. You should really check it out. You're missing it. You're missing something really amazing there. And now with a plugin here, and a connection between ChatGPT to Wolfram Alpha, I can just ask normal language math questions and get back very accurate, well-formatted, even plotted and graphed answers to advanced math questions, organic chemistry, theoretical physics, you name it. Wolfram Alpha can do all of this, and now so can ChatGPT thanks to these plugins. I showed this code interpreter feature, which had just come online, but I want to mention it again here tonight, just in terms of kind of exploding our collective brains. Here's an example of someone who, with the code interpreter feature, uploaded a CSV of data into ChatGPT and said, hey, dig around in here and find some trends and visualize them for me. Literally just a single prompt and upload a file, and ChatGPT spits back a variety of visualizations and a couple of high-level takeaways. The same thing here. Ethan Mollick, who's become one of my favorite follows. If you're not following him on Twitter and you're into AI, I'd highly recommend him to you. Here he uploaded census data and said, hey, generate some interesting hypotheses here, test them with data. Oh, and by the way, put it into a paper. And so here's a toy paper that's maybe 1,200 words long with an intro, methodology, results, and discussion. And he didn't even come up with the hypotheses. He just gave it data, said, you come up with some hypotheses, create some charts, dump it into a paper kind of format. Very, very interesting and potentially powerful for helping you. You may have collected data that you've done one kind of analysis on. And you think, I wonder if I could publish anything else off those data. I wonder if there's anything else interesting hiding in those data that I have. Here's a really creative companion to help you kind of explore some of that. ChatGPT also, if you are a Plus subscriber, is now capable of browsing the web. So now you can say, hey, go summarize the most recent research findings about impact of COVID-19. And it takes a minute or two, and you can watch it as it's working, going out, browsing, searching Google, clicking on links, reading. And then it comes back and said, sure, here's what I found. Let me summarize it for you. Here are all the links out to the different articles in Nature that I read that I used to generate this summary for you. So does it still hallucinate? Of course it still hallucinates. But when you ask it to go looking for a good academic research, then you can judge whether you think Nature is a reliable source or not, and whether it's done a good job of summarizing. This web browsing capability was not there for everyone 2 weeks ago. One thing that is exploding, I keep saying exploding their minds, blowing our brains, is AutoGPT, which was the first of a family of little tools now. There's an Agent GPT, there's Baby AGI, there's a couple of these. AutoGPT is an autonomous GPT experiment, by which I mean you can say to AutoGPT, hey, I want you to teach me, now this is kind of meta, I want you to teach me about AutoGPT. And it will say, okay, well, let me come up with a list of goals. What are the things that I would need to accomplish in order to do that? Does that list of goals look good? Yes, okay. Well, the first step is I'm going to do this. Here's the reason why I think I should do this. Here's my plan for this part. Here are potential problems I anticipate. Now I'm going to go run that step. And when I finish running that step, I'm going to take the output of that step and I'm going to plug it back in as the input to step 2, and I'm going to keep going. And it can just run multiple steps with memory, taking the output from the previous step, plugging it into the next step. And so instead of ChatGPT just being kind of conversational, where you ask and it answers and you ask and it answers, now you can say, plan my wedding, including, finding me a venue, finding me a caterer, these 7 steps. It can browse the web, it can pull all that information together, it can look at reviews, and it builds a plan, builds steps for accomplishing each task in the plan, and just recursively works its way through here. Significantly more powerful than just the conversational interface that we have in ChatGPT and its popularity in GitHub. Oh, did I mention that you can download it and install it and run it on your own computer? It's become extraordinarily popular. And then if maybe if you didn't know Hugging Face, maybe that's the most valuable thing that you can get out of my 5 or 6 minutes here is Hugging Face is this community space where people who work on machine learning kinds of things get together, build models, train models, share models with each other, share data sets with each other. And because there are so many of these LLMs available now, Hugging Face has developed this just kind of open leaderboard where you can see against these 4 kind of traditional tests that LLMs are traditionally judged according to, here are all the top performing models right now. Like, how do you sort through the 50 models that are available? Well, they can help you do that. And once you're ready to start building your own application using this tech, and you've seen, well, these 3 or 4 models look like they're pretty good, but I'm still not sure exactly which one I want, then a tool like Chat All will let you type in your prompt one time and get responses from multiple LLMs back at the same time, so you can evaluate all these responses much more quickly. And you can see down here, ChatGPT and Bing and some of these other models being represented here. So there's just in the last 2 weeks, right? There's so much happening so fast since we talked about this before. And I gotta say just a word about 2 other things before we wrap up, because the multimedia front is moving forward very rapidly. The Stable Diffusion folks this week open sourced they've hosted service called Dream Studio. They've open sourced that now and made it so that you can download it, and they call it Stable Studio, and you can run on your own computer, on your own hardware, type in your own prompts, mess with settings, hit the button, and generate images. This is the craziest demo that I saw this week. This is a machine learning tool in which you can input an image and then click, say, this is here, I want it to go there. And then the algorithm just says, well, this is what it would look like if I put that part of this thing there. It's like Photoshop, but it's completely on steroids. You just say, I want this car turned more that way, or I want the horse's feet to look like this, or I want the elephant trunk to look like that. And it just changes them. It's complete. It's so out of control. I love it. It's amazing. And if you didn't hear the announcement from Apple about their new personal voice service, if you have an iPhone, and something similar for Android can't be that far away, but you can speak a certain number of specific phrases into your phone, and your phone will clone your voice so that anytime it does text to speech, it speaks with your voice instead of with a random computer generated voice. So just so much happening at the forefront here. We talked 2 weeks ago about the first empirical study of the impact of ChatGPT on work. There was another study in the intervening 2 weeks, this one out of MIT, looking at access to ChatGPT on mid-level professional writing tasks. Productivity improved by 37%. The quality of the writing increased by 3/4 of a point on a 7-point scale. And to me, most interestingly, this quote from the paper, inequality between workers decreases as ChatGPT compresses the productivity distribution by benefiting low ability workers more. So it closes the performance gap between low productivity and high productivity workers. Again, I said this in my wrap up last time. As more and more of these studies come out that show that these tools make people in the workplace more and more productive, more and more effective, there's going to be more and more demand for our graduates to have these kinds of skills. So again, how competitive are our students going to be if we've taught them how to use these tools effectively? How competitive are they going to be if we've tried to punish and prohibit them from using them, right? Sam Altman, who's the CEO of OpenAI, which is a company that makes ChatGPT, went to Washington, D.C. and testified to Congress. And what he did when he went to testify was he asked them, please regulate the AI industry. I don't think any CEO has ever gone to Washington and said, please regulate us, and regulate us a lot. And the reason that he did that, I recommended that everybody read this paper. We have no note 2 weeks ago. I still recommend it to you. In this paper, which was leaked from Google, the author says that neither we, meaning Google, nor OpenAI have any moats In the business context, a moat is something that creates a barrier that makes it harder for competitors to enter your market and compete with you. They're saying we basically have no way of protecting ourselves. Anybody can spin up one of these models. Anybody can do this kind of work. So when Altman goes to Congress and says we need lots of regulation, we need licensing requirements, we need it to be very thorough, what he really means is make the regulation very complex and very expensive and make it so that open source people can't afford to develop AI. Make it so that only companies with really deep pockets are able to work here. Basically, we don't have a moat, but Congress, you could build one for us if you mandated lots of complex and costly regulation and licensing requirements. So again, and this is the way I closed last time, is there a lot for us to figure out? Yes. Are there legitimate concerns and even dangers? Yes. But oh my gosh, it will be so worth it as we figure out how to work through these issues and get our students kind of set up to work in and succeed in this future world. And because it's the last time we're going to be together, I also wanted to say, I mean, you see what's happened in 2 weeks, right? The only limits to the way that we could use these tools to support learning are just our imagination and creativity and technical capability. And if you feel like you're short on one of those, go get a partner, go get a research group, get a co-founder, get a team, but like no excuses. There's so much that's possible right now. And if you feel like you can't do what you want to do on your own, go find some people and do it together. It's just such an exciting time. So that's a little more than the 5 to 7 minutes I promised the organizers. I apologize. But looking forward to hopefully some engaging conversation.
Great, thank you so much. And we only actually had one question come into the Q&A. People were very excited to get your slides, so we will be sending all of those out with a recording. Did have an interesting question in the Q&A. Will AI create opportunities for extreme liberty and freedom for students? I don't know if any of you want to tackle that.
I provided a brief comment and I was hoping to get some interesting questions. My comment was, it really depends on how we define liberty and freedom in this case for education. If there are no other questions, I do have 2 questions actually. One question is for both Dr. Matt Bauer and Dr. Wiley, and the other question would be for Dr. Frick. So my first question is, what are your views on having ChatGPT and other generative AI tools as a collaborator in addition to using it as a tool? So what are the biggest opportunities and challenges by your view?
And by collaborator, do you, and this is actually a very interesting question that I've been thinking about in terms of how we position and conceptualize AI compared to other technologies. I wrote a British Journal of Educational Technology paper called Technology Mediated Learning Theory. And the fundamental premise of that paper, this is from 2019, was that there is a difference between technology and humans in that humans are always going to have agency in a way that technologies can't. And then ChatGPT, and which is increasing so radically at the moment, comes along, and whether or not we actually say that it is sentient, for a lot of intents and purposes, it doesn't matter. It can do things like act with agency. There have been situations where they've used it to, they've taken it beyond the sort of the guardrails, and it's been able to go and hire someone from TaskRabbit to actually get around some of the capture, little press the square things that you see sometimes to ensure that the person responding isn't just some chatbot, that it's a human. So it's able to simulate this sort of agency as though it's a human. So I guess the question that we need to ask is, is this going to be a genuine collaborator rather than a tool we use? And that sort of goes back to what Theodore was saying, think of it more of a tool than a creature. But for all intents and purposes, it may be able to more and more act as though it was a creature, depending on the specific things that you want it to do. So I guess that's a little bit of a rambling answer to say that I think increasingly it is going to be able to behave a lot more like a collaborator, and that we, I guess, need to think about how we're going to appropriately acknowledge that and account for that in the work that we do.
I don't think I have anything to add to that answer.
Thank you. I got that question only because in journalism, some people have been using such tools to generate news articles, and also APA recently has suggested we should cite the content generated by ChatGPT. So anyway, thank you so much for your thoughts. The question I have for Dr. Frick is about the quotes. One of the quotes he shared: "Think of AI as a tool, not a creature." It made me think of we all know that generative AI tools have great potential for education, but some AI engineers' concerns make it sound like some concerns. So these concerns have made us many educators think of it as a diligently learning creature or learning child. So in this case, for example, the recent comments by Jeffrey Hinton and the other Google engineer last year, the comment he made regarding the interview of a chatbot. So how should educators take such perspectives from these engineers when thinking about the future with generative AI? I guess this is a question started with Dr. Frick's quote, but it's a question for all three panelists. Thank you.
Well, let me tell you a story, and why I'm concerned about this the way I am. We in the instructional systems technology program at Indiana University have had a doctoral program for quite a few decades, and for our PhD students, we used to have written and oral qualifying exams, and we later modified that. But I remember one in particular, and then there were several, and these were the reason that we changed our qualifying procedure, and we actually modified our doctoral program. And the way that when people have finished their coursework, they would take their written quals. If they passed their written quals, they would take an oral qualifying exam. And this would be in front of a committee of 4 or 5 faculty on the students advisory committee. And we would start asking them questions about various things that they'd not only written in the written portion of the exam, but also other things in the field that they ought to know about. And this one student, and I'll call them a they, just because I want to keep them anonymous, started responding to the questions, and the responses sounded pretty good, said the sort of things that I think they wanted us to hear. And basically, they had done a very good job of essentially memorizing a lot of things that were said in the readings that were the basis of the qualifying exam. We had hundreds and hundreds of articles and books and things like that that were part of the qualifying procedure that they were supposed to know about, and they also used in their courses. And so we began to ask this person some questions about what they were saying, probing questions. And it soon became apparent that they didn't really know what they were talking about. They did not know what they were talking about. They said all the right words, but when we asked them to give an example or critical awareness kinds of questions that would indicate whether they really understood what they were saying, and that person just could not respond. It was very, very telling. We had to fail that person in the oral exam because that wasn't acceptable. And when I started testing first ChatGPT and then Google Bard, and I've also done some testing of Bing Chat, it reminded me of that doctoral student and several others we ran into who, when they got to their qualifying exams, it's like they memorized all this stuff. They knew the right words. They could put the words together in ways that sounded pretty good. But if you really pushed them a little bit, they didn't know what they were talking about. And that was shocking and embarrassing. And as faculty, we looked at each other and said, oh my gosh, we got to do something different in our program because we can't let this happen. This was a great disservice to not only the student, but to the faculty trying to teach them. And so that's the kind of feeling I get when I interact with these chatbots. And the reason for that is they don't know what they're talking about. They do not know what they are talking about, but they are very, very articulate and very good in English or whatever language syntax you're using. And there's another thing that's actually kind of interesting to me, and that is sort of an ability to synthesize, because they're really built on just a mass of data, textual data, the chatbots are. And so what they're really reflecting are trends of human thought or thinking. And sometimes I was surprised in a good sort of way about the sort of connections that the chatbot was making, say between some of the work that I've done and some other things. At first I thought, wait a minute, no, that's not right. And then I started thinking, well, wait a minute, that could be. And so that's another area where you might think of these as ways of summarizing trends or tendencies in human thought, okay? Despite the weaknesses that we've discussed, such as hallucinating. But that's another kind of outcome that might be useful. And I was talking with a former student who's doing actually a doctoral dissertation on machine learning, and I've been working with, not on his committee, but at another university, and saying, well, he's struggling right now. I'm not on his committee, but he's struggling on writing his dissertation proposal. And this is a student I'd worked with at IU back in 2008, 2010, in that era. He's since gone on. He's gone to another university to do his doctorate. And he was really struggling to do his dissertation proposal. And I said, well, why don't you just ask ChatGPT to write it for you? And so that's a kind of interesting way of thinking about some of these tools as a starting point. Like it would be interesting to see what it would come up with. By the way, one of the big flaws right now is that these neural nets are not very good at citing their sources, because that's not how they're built. And so they really hallucinate when you ask them for sources. The way that Microsoft Chat or Bing Chat is working around this, and likewise Google Bard, is they're starting to compare the outcomes from their chatbot with searches, Google searches or Bing searches, and then can coordinate those two in order to figure out what looks good and what doesn't look good in terms of what might be factually true. So that's the downside. But the upside is, I wonder how that would work. And actually, I did this in the paper that I've submitted to Tech Trends. I asked Google's Bard to write the article for me. And I've included that in the article. And I'm citing, quoting Google Bard for this, and it actually did a pretty decent job. So I was kind of surprised. I think I'll just stop there. I don't even remember the question you started with, other than the big thing that I keep thinking about is that they're very good at manipulating the signs, the words that we use, but they're not necessarily, they really don't have any conceptual understanding or in-depth knowledge of what they're talking about. So it's a very kind of shallow, superficial treatment of something. On the other hand, there are some uses that can be quite amazing, as David was referring to. You can do a lot of very interesting things. You just got to be careful. It's like that chef's knife. You know, you got to be careful, or you can do some damage if you're not watching out what you're doing.
Great. Well, thank you. And so we have kept you a little bit later because there's just so many wonderful things to learn here. But we will send out a recording. When you leave this webinar, there is a short survey. One of the questions on there is, what would you like to see next? Because as David mentioned, in 2 weeks, so much has changed. So we know that we're going to have to keep having more discussions around AI in education, and we are happy to do that. So on behalf of Systems Thinking and Change and the Division of Emerging Learning Technology and the Learner Engagement Division at AECT, we really thank you for participating in these webinars, and we hope you enjoyed it as much as we did.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.